IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me two guests for a special conversation on India's relationship with China, but also a little bit more than that, about how India can secure itself going forward, given that dynamics around the world are changing and those are also impinging on our relationship, not just with China, but also in the broader region. So let me welcome first Ambassador Nirupaman Rao. We all know her. She was the Indian Foreign Secretary at one point of time. She served as the ambassador, as India's ambassador to the US, to China, and High Commissioner to Sri Lanka. She's a decorated Foreign Service officer. And I'm very curious to ask her because she was part of the member of the Special Representative team at one point of time in 2003, if I'm correct, on the border talks with China. So I would like to sort of even dwell a little bit on that at one point of time in this conversation. And I have with me, obviously, General Prakash Menon. Lieutenant General Prakash Menon is a Director of Strategic Studies at Takshashila, but a decorated soldier who's served in many, many different locations, and and all of our listeners are very familiar with him. So I want to sort of go ahead first talking to you, Ambassador Rao. I want to first get your sense about what's happened over the last 2.5 months between India and China. Yes, of course, the Galwan incident of June 15th, you've called it a watershed moment. I want you to explain to us why and how that's sort of changed the dynamic. And then I want you to sort of tell us a little bit about your views on what's happened since then with this process of disengagement.
Thank you, Manoj. It's wonderful to be on the show. And today you added a new phrase to the diplomatic lexicon, decorated Foreign Service. It's just very interesting to be referred to in those terms. Well, to answer your question, I think this whole topic of what has happened in the last 2.5 months on our border, or at least on the line of actual control with China, has been discussed threadbare. And I think we've almost reached a point of discussion fatigue on the issue. But I referred to it as a watershed moment or a turning point in our relations with China because it essentially broke the structure of what we had built in the last 3 decades, as it were, in the relationship with China, where we had understood the intractable nature of the boundary dispute between the two countries, but had agreed that we would continue our efforts to seek a peaceful resolution, while at the same time ensuring that we maintained peace and tranquility in the border areas, and also sought to develop relations across a broad spectrum of engagement. So in many senses, what is the future of our engagement with China? Because all the rules of engagement seem to have been disturbed as a result of what we saw happen in Galwan and the continuing tension, in fact, that we see in the Ladakh sector along the line of actual control. So the government has its task cut out for it, and I feel that the time has come to completely reformulate our strategy vis-a-vis China. It has to include elements of, obviously, discussion and engagement, but it will also have to look seriously at such issues as containment or new partnerships or deepening partnerships that we will have to pursue across the region in order to deal with the felt threat from China.
I wanted to sort of push a little bit on that. Before we come to the point about how do we deal with this, let's just look at why this problem exists. And like you said, there's been lots of discussion on the LAC and the sort of lack of clarity on it also. And I mean, every time we've seen such incidents in the past, we've heard governments say things like, oh, there is a difference of perception about the LAC, and therefore you see all these incidents happening. Galwan was obviously completely different from that. But why is it, and we also heard that the Chinese have been reluctant to share their perception of the LAC or their perception of their own territorial claims. Given that you've been ambassador to China, given that you've been part of the team of special representatives way back, why is this reluctance from the Chinese to clarify things?
I think firstly it points to the propensity that is increasingly displayed by China to change its positions or to move various pawns across the chessboard and not be stuck with any defined formula when it comes to how we resolve such issues as differences in perception across the line of actual control. And this despite the fact that at least the first two agreements on peace and tranquility and confidence building in the border areas along the line of actual control of 1993 and 1996 did include clauses and sections that spoke about the need for a joint perception of the line of actual control being arrived at, so with both sides exchanging each other's perceptions and coming to a joint conclusion as to how to deal with the subject, even if we may not have arrived at an agreed line of actual control. So the Chinese have gone back essentially on understandings that we had all along assumed that they would stick to. And today, all the indications that we hear and we pick up in terms of signals from the Chinese side is that that train has left the station and they're not going to be discussing any questions of perception of the line of actual control with India, which leads you to ask, where do we, in a sense, go from there? If there is any point to go to after this. So it really, their obduracy creates a new complication in this whole already complex process.
All right, General Menon, with that sort of a backdrop, I want to sort of ask you about your view on what we've seen play out in the last 20 days or so with, 2 rounds of talks between the core commanders and then what both sides are saying, some degree of disengagement that has taken place. I want your sort of sense on how you see what's happening currently.
Well, as far as the talks are concerned, I think yesterday or day before yesterday's Chinese official spokesman's statement, which reads, translated as border troops have disengaged in most localities, the situation on the ground is de-escalating and the temperature is coming down. This has not even been commented upon by our own External Affairs Ministry. Either we agree to what they are saying, or as the Chinese themselves are saying, we have had so many rounds of talks, a 5th round of talks are pending, and then further de-escalation will work from there. But the fact that the Chinese are saying that most of the de-escalation or disengagement has been done is worrying, because on the ground, from sources, open sources, that is definitely not the case. And especially, of course, acknowledge that in Pangangso, it has definitely not happened. And in many other areas too. So the Chinese are claiming that disengagement has taken place in most areas. We are not making an official statement about it. Open sources are telling us that very little disengagement, except, of course, in the Galwan Valley, where certain amount of disengagement has taken place. So what it indicates is that the Chinese are saying that wherever we had to go back, we've gone back if we had to. In fact, they are actually saying it is the Indians who actually had to go back, and the Indians have gone back according to them. And therefore, there is not much left to actually decide. So they're telling us that if India is claiming that the status quo has to be restored, it's nearly done. So there is a mismatch between the Indian position and the Chinese position. And that's certainly worrying. And when I say this, I think in a larger picture, we need to look at what the Chinese are doing on the border, what they've done so far, not about the boundary dispute itself, but actually about how China is using the boundary dispute for purposes to probably send us a message for different reasons, for the bigger picture. And I think we are missing the wood for the trees if we don't understand that bigger picture, because Chinese, as Ambassador Rao has said, have constantly been changing their position. It is not that they have not told us where their claim lines are. Whenever it suits them, they will bring out a claim line. They've done that recently in Galwan itself. So the question is, China uses the border dispute as a pressure point to pressurize India to influence its strategic behavior. We have to understand this basic gameplay if you want to deal with this situation. China is not interested in solving the border dispute. It has kept it alive. At one point in time, probably it thought it should. But I think as China's power equations rose, China realized the role India can play, and therefore has now identified the northern border as a pressure point. And that's what it's been doing. So if we want to look at this situation from an Indian perspective, we need to understand this game play. And definitely the Chinese positions on the disengagement itself tells the story. They are not interested in going back to the status quo. They are not even talking about the status quo. Neither are we talking about LAC. Even in the statements of their foreign minister and our NSA, they have not even spoken about the LAC. Right, as Ambassador Rao said, they have long since downplayed the notion of LAC. In fact, some of the Global Times writings, you would say, has said that the notion does not actually exist. It is not relevant. So we are in actually a situation where they have changed the status quo, but we are engaging in talks with them, and they are definitely not in a hurry to resolve it. And then we have to look at it from what this means for the larger picture.
Ambassador Rao, would you concur with that? Is that the message that the Chinese are trying to send us? I mean, every time we have this conversation about the message that the Chinese are trying to send us, I remember having a conversation with Ambassador Shivshankar Menon where he says things like, if you want to send us a message, call us, write us a note to us. What's the point of this message which we are struggling to decode 2 months in? So is it the message that the Chinese are trying to send to us that, this is the strategic sort of pressure point that they want to use? And if they want to use it, what do they want to achieve?
To my mind, Manoj, there's a heart of darkness at the very center of the India-China relationship. And that darkness has to do very much with the Chinese attitude towards India. And you see it. You've seen it play out, of course, in the tensions along the line of actual control. I mean, just the boldness and the temerity with which they've advanced their claims into areas where they've never been. You see it playing out in the neighborhood in the way they've built assets and leverages with our smaller South Asian neighbors. Leave aside Pakistan, which of course is the big problem as far as we are concerned. And you see it in Chinese actions across the board with other countries too. But coming to what affects India per se, we have to face this, I don't know what you would call it, 800-pound gorilla across our borders. It's a long land border. It's a contested border. It's an unsettled border, and now it's a border that is increasingly militarized, where armed coexistence prevails instead of peaceful coexistence. So whatever we may say of all the external balancing that we need to do in the Indo-Pacific and with our other friends and partners, ultimately we have to face this adversary, this enemy of ours, squarely across this frontier, deal with the tensions that are rising, and understand what our long-term strategy needs to be vis-a-vis China. And I think the nation has to focus on that. There has to be a consensus, a political consensus across the board. The opposition has to work with the government. The government has to be much more strategic in its communication, has to be much more open and less ambivalent about where it stands on these issues. It's all very well to say that you want India to be a leading power, that we will stake out plurilateral partnerships across the world, that alliances need to be redefined. All that is very well, but when it comes to the brass tacks, what are we going to do vis-a-vis China? That is the million-dollar question that faces the nation.
All right, so that's a question that I'm going to come to. But before I come to that, General Menon and Ambassador, both of you, I want to share two bits of information with you that have happened in the last 2 days, which will impinge on India beyond just the boundary dispute. So a day or so ago, you had the Chinese foreign minister meeting with counterparts from Pakistan, Nepal, Afghanistan. And the readout of that meeting basically said that, yes, you want to sort of work together on dealing with the pandemic, but also about actively promoting the construction of CPEC and the Trans-Himalayan three-dimensional interconnection network, work together on physical connectivity and regional connectivity, and also regional security. So that's sort of point one. And today I was reading in the People's Daily, there's an interesting piece by the Dean of the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University, where he essentially talks about China's peripheral diplomacy. A lot of it is easily dismissed, but there's something really interesting here when he talks about over the last few years, since 2013, which is when that first peripheral diplomacy conference was held, they've come up with a plan which entails regular high-level meetings and visits formally and informally, which entails formations of 5 to 10-year plans for what you want to do with these relationships, which entail broader scope of engagement, which is essentially whole of government, whole of society engagement with countries in your periphery, and using BRI. Now, all of this obviously will impinge on India. And we've seen that, right? Because as China's sort of engagement with our neighborhood has increased, that's sort of created more pressure. And in the last couple of months, we've seen that. We've seen tensions with Pakistan. Those are not new to us, but tensions with Nepal are new to us. Sri Lanka is heading for elections. There is again this whole dynamic of Chinese engagement in Sri Lanka, given that they've just set up a political parties forum there. So I wanted to get your sense on the broader sort of South Asian region in Indian subcontinent and the sense of shift that's taking place, and how would India sort of tackle that in the context of this border issue? Is that something that the Chinese are trying to sort of suggest to us, along with what's happening at the border, that there is pressure from all sides on India?
Yeah, certainly. Of course, this is a matter of concern for us. It's not something which has happened overnight. It's been a process which has been in motion for a long time, and the Chinese advancement into our neighborhood is actually gaining strength, and the fact that we have been unable to slow it down or stop it is quite obvious. And now let us be clear. I mean, there is nothing much to it. The writing is on the wall what China is up to. It's not only as a border dispute which it leverages, it is also about exerting its power in our neighborhood and turning the neighbors against us. So let us not have any doubts about Chinese intentions. The larger question which we need to see is how do we counterbalance it, one. And two is what other measures do we need to take? The time for that decision is long overdue. We are still talking about and concentrating about disengagement and de-escalation of the border, but we are not talking about what are we doing in the larger scale of things, which is what finally will matters, and which the Ambassador Rao actually had referred to right in the beginning itself. The time for that decision has come, but we don't see any such movement. We probably see certain weak signals which we want to send by a conversation, let's say, with the Australian Prime Minister, but those are not actually going to impact what China or slow down what China is doing on the periphery. So that therefore requires a different scale of actions. And of course, we are handicapped by the fact that now the economy has taken a serious blow. China has got much more economic clout which it will use. And since most of these countries are also in the same economic devastation, they also obviously will be easy for China to actually influence. But that does not mean that we do not take steps which we need to take. And if the policy is, let us wait and see, I think the time for that is over.
All right. Ambassador Rao, I just want to get first your thoughts on the periphery. What are things that India should be doing in our in the broader Indian subcontinent?
Okay. Manoj, first of all, I think when it comes to India-China relations, contrary to the tenor of the debate in the public space that we see and hear today, I think, first of all, we must come to understand that the India-China relationship, even after what happened in Galwan, is not an all or nothing proposition. There are many, many shades in between that we have to face and we have to explore. It's not that we can abandon the project altogether and think of all the other balancing that we can do. I don't believe that is realistic at all. And we need more self-confidence and less paranoia in dealing with China, as many experts have said long ago. As far as the periphery is concerned, the facts of geography, of ethnicity, of culture, economic compulsions, all that, essentially there is a gravitational pull that still is there when it comes to our South Asian neighbors and India. And I think that is a strength that we can ill afford to forego, even if China has made so many significant inroads into the region. So this is the time, I think, for much greater self-confidence and not, to turn our faces to the wall and say that, things are getting increasingly difficult for us. They may be, but as I said, it's not an all or nothing proposition. So that's really something we should keep in mind. I think as far as China is concerned, our first priority is essentially to staunch the blood flow, as it were, along the line of actual control. We need that disengagement. We need to see that tensions reduce. And we have to look at all these peace and tranquility agreements that we signed over the years. They were not bad frameworks or templates to deal with the issue. Where did we go wrong? How can they be strengthened? It's not that the Chinese, I believe, they don't want to abandon them either. We have to keep this channel open with China. Chinese talk about keeping the big picture in the relationship in our sights. All that is very well, but I think the main focus is to ensure that this line of actual control doesn't stay live the way it has for the last 2.5 months. And the other thing is we have to be vigilant about what happens in the middle and middle sector and in Sikkim and in Arunachal Pradesh, because given this new aggressiveness and expansionist moves on the part of the Chinese, we have to prepare for any eventuality. So on the one hand, talk to them, and on the other hand, be resolute and build your resilience and be prepared.
All right. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to talk about a framework that Ambassador Rao, you spoke about recently at a conversation at the Institute of Chinese Studies, where you spoke about India's approach being about securing its future. Now, to me, like I spoke to you about before this conversation, it meant a couple of things. It meant having the capacity to deter aggression, having the capacity to impose costs in case of aggression, but also, like you just pointed out, having a channel with the Chinese where you're talking and you can set up, if not sort of continue with the existing framework agreements that we've had, which have held the peace for a very long period of time. But they are under pressure right now because circumstances have changed, capacities have changed on both sides. So what would be the steps that we would take to do some of these things? I mean, principally, everybody sort of talks about some of these things, but what would be the tangible steps that you take? I mean, working with partners, like you said, is one thing, but working with partners where, to what degree? The constant question that we get asked about, is India joining an alliance? Is the Quad an alliance? Should we look to the seas? What sort of capacity do we need to be able to do some of these, deter, impose costs, and hopefully even have a conversation and get to new agreements?
I think we have to be very ambidextrous, and we have to certainly look to the seas, our natural assets in the Indian Ocean. And the Quad may not be an alliance, but it's more than a dialogue. And certainly in the military strategic area, it has, in a sense, raised its profile in the recent past. And I think that seems to be an inevitable process moving forward. With the United States, of course, we'll have to see what the outcome of the presidential election is going to be. But I believe with the bipartisan consensus that exists between both parties when it comes to relations with India, and in singling out India as essentially at the heart of this ongoing initiative on the part of democracies, especially the Western democracies, to build a countervailing influence and balance against China. We are going to be at the heart of this, whatever we may be hesitant about, and we may be, in the past at least, a bit wary about treading on this terrain. I think we have to increasingly smell the coffee on this. We'll have to face up to the realities and be prepared to be much more bold and much more willing to raise our profile, whether it comes to the naval exercises that we do near the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, how to strategize our assets in the Andamans much more effectively, what the Quad is going to do in the years ahead. What are the areas besides military and strategic, whether it's technology, whether it's export controls, whether it's standardization of our capacities. There are many, many more policy areas that remain to be explored, and I think we should be prepared to do that. And also, since we are, we proclaim constantly our democratic credentials, how do we leverage these credentials a little better when we talk about open societies, when we talk about governance, transparency, sustainable development, everything that the Chinese don't do?
All right. General Menon, I want to ask you the same question, but with the added input of, there's lots of talk about, using also cultivating asymmetric military options vis-a-vis China. What are the options that we should be looking to cultivate to do some of these things, deter, impose costs?
Yeah, I think one of the first things we need to change the narrative about is that India is not in a position to hold its own against Chinese aggression. I think we have started believing the Chinese rhetoric on it, and we seem to be assuming that China's GDP is 5 times that of India, and that is going to be a point of consideration when in the snowy heights of Ladakh. And I'm afraid that we must disabuse ourselves of the notion that doesn't matter when actually push comes to shove there. Because firstly, let's at least understand that what the Chinese have done is not come and attack our territory. They have used our agreements to come and occupy territory which was unoccupied either by them or by us. So the aggression, the nature of the aggression is not about military weakness. It is about exploitation of a political agreement. And there is a lot of difference between the two. That's point one. Point two, with the time which has elapsed, I think India's state of mobilization is sufficient enough that the Chinese will not be able to carry out any major military action which can actually result in an adversity against us. Because, as you said, the border is very long, it's unheld in most places. India can also retaliate, and what was normally described as quid pro quo, we can actually do what the Chinese have done to us. And that's something, it is an option which was available when this took place. I don't understand why it was not done. We could have easily done it. And even now, if Chinese actually want to escalate, we have options with us. So that's one for the northern border is concerned. And this time around, I think we have to be very clear that especially as far as air power is concerned, at the point where it will matter, we actually have an advantage because our Air Force will operate from the plains, whereas theirs have to operate from the high altitude airfields of Tibet. And that makes a difference in the application of air power. But I think we have to move beyond reaction only on the northern border to leverage whatever advantages we have in the Indian Ocean. And those are actually where the scale is completely different. The question is, what can we do? I don't have to tell you what we can do. I can assure you that this has been the bread and butter of the Indian Navy for a long time to come, or carrying out maritime operations less than war. And I'm sure they would have had enough targets, soft, which are available. India's sights It's only a question of whether the politicians want to actually move and do something in that arena. But options are available. So it's not the case, as the Chinese in the statements very clearly tell us, that they are too strong and we cannot fight them. That, I think, is something which, especially from the debate in our TV, I find that people seem to have imbibed. But it is a completely wrong picture. And I think that narrative we ourselves, and Ambassador Rao talks about the self-confidence which we need to have. The military has self-confidence. I don't know if the politicians have the same.
All right, gentlemen. Ambassador Rao, I want to end with one last question to you. You also served as the ambassador to the US, importantly. Still, there is a lot of vacillation in India about the relationship with the US, at least in popular discourse, whether it's in government or not is a separate matter altogether. There's this anxiety about being close to the US that exists. And given the sort of flux that we're seeing right now heading into the presidential elections in November, and also the nature of the competition that's developing between the US and China, where Mike Pompeo last week essentially framed it in the context of a new Cold War. Is it something that India needs to be wary about? Or are we reading too much into this? Should we be confident, like you said, about our own sort of standing in this and our ability to take independent decisions despite partnering with a country like the US?
Well, I certainly think we should be confident about our ability to take independent decisions. And while we may not want an alliance with the United States, somebody said we can certainly have a joint venture with the United States. Or I would call it a common law marriage with the United States. Call it what you will. But I think we need to be less hesitant about it. Not that we need to put all our eggs in one basket. And that is why, across the Indo-Pacific, what are the partnerships and tie-ups that we would like to pursue with heightened intensity, whether it's Japan, whether it's Australia, whether it's the smaller Southeast Asian neighbors. And we've always maintained that ASEAN is at the center of our Indo-Pacific strategy. And I know the ASEAN sits on the fence when it comes to China. So there are all kinds of permutations and combinations here. So we have to essentially feel our way carefully, without hesitation, with much more self-confidence, as I mentioned, with less hesitation and no looking over the shoulder too much. But at the same time, not foregoing our old interests. For instance, Russia, is also going to play a key part. Even if the Russian foreign minister said no to the Indo-Pacific, the fact is that, Russia and India talked about a greater connectivity, the Chennai-Vladivostok corridor, for instance, and with Russia, our defense, tie-ups and our long-standing, connections to Russia, especially when it comes to military hardware and the sourcing of it and the spare parts. And, that connection hasn't gone away so easily. And on top of it, you have the very, very close Russia-China relationship today. I think we need to leverage our connections with Russia and the kind of mutual confidence between the leaderships of the two countries a little more smartly. So I think smart diplomacy is very much the need of the hour. But as far as the China front is concerned, talking about battles and battlefields, I don't think we want to reincarnate a full-scale battlefront with China, but China is going to look at pinning us down. It's looking at a strategy of friction and attrition, and we should be prepared for it.
All right. So on that sober yet somewhat optimistic note, I'm going to call this conversation to a close. Thank you so much, Ambassador Rao, and thank you so much, General Menon. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. Some really fun guests on the network this week. Cyrus welcomed Dia Mirza to come and have a conversation about all kinds of different things. Danny Morrison was on Edges and Sledges, the cricket podcast. If you haven't heard that, that's always a fun listen. And Rahul Subramanian was on Football Should Fall to grow their ever more exciting list of guests. And it's not just that. Mantra Mugdha, old friend of ours, was on Advertising is Dead. Manu Pillai was on the Filter Coffee podcast. It's been one great guest after the other. And with that, we hope to catch you again next week.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.